they were dropping and dropped over 200,000 some cluster bombs on Serbia. Many of them are still there. Many of them are still doing damage. Cluster bombs are used not to knock down buildings, but to kill people. They're meant to kill people. NATO bombed the marketplace in Niš, a city in southern Serbia, in the middle of the afternoon during the market. Killed a lot of elderly people and old women who were out buying their vegetables. All of this was covered up by NATO propaganda machine. And even today you will hear that NATO's little war in Kosovo was done, achieved its purposes, it stopped genocide, it stopped ethnic cleansing, and it prevented Serbia from maintaining its province of Kosovo. As Scott intimated in his talk, even after the bombing stopped, that is when the real ethnic cleansing took place. But it was of the non-Albanian population of Kosovo. And those few Serbs that remain there I've been in Kosovo a year ago. The few Serbs that are remaining there, as you can see, are living under dreadful conditions. If they leave the ghetto, they are either beaten at best and murdered at worst. It's a dreadful situation, and yet no one in the West knows very much about it at all. When the Taliban blew up the two figures of the Buddhists several years ago, it was headline news around the world. The fact that 150 Christian churches and monasteries have been destroyed in Kosovo, who knows about it? Very few people. The worst part, in my view as well, about the bombing of Kosovo is that it was deliberate, it was planned. I'm going to read you an excerpt from the Republican Policy Council in the United States. 7 months before the bombing, they were discussing the Balkans. Here's a quote. The U.S. Senate Republican Policy Committee reports that planning for a U.S.-led NATO intervention in Kosovo is largely in place. The only missing element seems to be an event with suitably vivid media coverage that could make the intervention politically saleable. That Clinton is waiting for a trigger is increasingly obvious. That trigger was soon to be pulled. It was the highly suspicious Racak massacre that Madeleine Albright said was the reason why the bombing took place. At Rambouillet, the so-called Rambouillet peace conference between Serbs and Albanians, the Americans would not allow either the Albanians or the Serbs to meet together face to face. And they decided what the peace terms should be. And when it looked as though Milosevic was going to accept the peace terms, the Americans panicked and at the last minute put an Appendix B onto the agreement and sent it to Milosevic. In Appendix B, they had worded it in such a way that they knew no president of Serbia could have accepted it. Two of the provisions, among many others that were objectionable, one was that NATO could have access to all of Serbia, and its troops could travel wherever it wanted and would not be subject to Serbian law. Secondly, that within 3 years there would be a referendum on autonomy or independence for the Albanians. Milosevic rejected that, and the bombing took place. As the bombing increased, a lot of other European allies and NATO members were beginning to be concerned. For 78 days, the most bombing that was taking place in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And German public opinion particularly became concerned, and NATO began to get nervous. They thought we better stop this war. So they sent the former Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, and Matti Ahtisaari, who was a former Finnish president, to see Milosevic and try and get Milosevic to agree on peace terms. They asked Milosevic, what do you need to have the bombing stopped? Milosevic said, no access to Serbia by NATO troops and no referendum in 3 years for the Albanian population on independence. Matti Ahtisaari and Chernomyrdin brought that back to NATO, and NATO agreed, and the bombing stopped. What started the war? Those two provisions of Appendix B. What stopped it 78 days later? When NATO, not Milosevic, NATO gave way and accepted Milosevic's terms. So it was a totally avoidable war, an unnecessary war. But NATO came out of it very proud and very smiling. It had a renewed agenda. It had new terms of reference. It could do now whatever it wanted to do, and it's been doing that ever since. This is part of the problem. And the public don't really know, and most of the media don't care. If you've seen George's movie, The Avoidable War, that has not been shown widely, and it never will be, because the mainstream media will not show it. As my time must almost be up, I think. But what I want to say is that we're part of that. We can blame it all we want on the United States. And indeed, they are primarily responsible. I mean, they're spending billions of dollars every day on defense. The total U.S. budget is more than the rest of the world combined, including China and Russia. They have military presence in 160 different countries. Even the extremely difficult financial situation the Americans now find themselves in, and all of the bailout of the banks and other organizations and businesses, they are not cutting back on their defense budget. And they're going to be sending more and more troops into Afghanistan. So while many of us had hoped that with Obama, a new president, there might be a change in policy, it doesn't look to me as though there's going to be. And when he appoints the old Kosovo hands, like Holbrooke and Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton, into the positions that they're now in, it doesn't look good for the future in terms of bringing NATO back to where it should be, making Article 1 still be the founding article of NATO, and inviting the Russians into it. Why should we be ringing Russia with a ring of steel? The Cold War is over, but the Americans seem insistent on continuing it. And they're putting, intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at Russia. They're putting missile units in Poland, in Hungary. They've got military maneuvers going on in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. After violating all of international law and declaring Kosovo to be an independent state, again in violation of the Charter, in violation of all of the principles that we stood for, state sovereignty, territorial integrity, they've completely closed their eyes to that and went ahead and did what they want to do, despite the warning from Putin, from Russia, who said, look, you can't do this, it's illegal, it's contrary to all law, it's a violation as well of the Helsinki Final Accords, you can't do this, but if you do, you set a precedent that I will follow. And if you give Kosovo its independence, I have much more justification in giving Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria its independence. And you're setting a precedent for people all around the world who want to declare independence to do so, and to do so by violence. So please don't go ahead with it. The Americans, and indeed most of the NATO countries, not all of them, have recognized Kosovo. It's not an independent state. It's a failed state. It's a criminal narco state. And only about 60 countries have recognized. Not all of the NATO countries have recognized. Spain has not. Greece has not. Slovakia has not. Because they know international law much better than the Americans do. I regret to say that Canada did recognize Kosovo independence, but there was terrific pressure from our neighbor to do so. The fact of the matter is, out of the 190-some countries of the United Nations, only 60 have recognized Kosovo. That'll give you an idea that the rest of the world does not buy into everything that NATO does. My final plea to you is that the real essence of a democracy is that citizens be alert and be knowledgeable, and to be careful what you read in the newspapers and hear in the radio, and particularly careful about what governments tell you. They're not always telling you the truth. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bissett. Those who have another class to go to, please do so quietly right now, and Mr. David Orchard will continue.